To Hell with Dying by Alice Walker. This story is in classic short fiction. Only masterpieces of literature are in this book. To hell with dying, my father would say. These children want Mr. Sweet. Mr. Sweet was a diabetic and an alcoholic and a guitar player, and lived down the road from us on a neglected cotton farm. My older brothers and sisters got the most benefit from Mr. Sweet, for when they were growing up, he had quite a few years ahead of him, and was so capable of being called back from the brink of death any number of times. Whenever the voice of my father reached him as he lay expiring, "To hell with dying, man," my father would say, pushing the wife away from the bedside in tears, although she knew the death was not necessarily the last one, unless Mr. Sweet really wanted it to be. These children want Mr. Sweet, and they did want him, for at a signal from father, they would come crowding around the bed and throw themselves on the covers, and whoever was the smallest at the time would kiss him all over his wrinkled brown face and tickle him so that he would laugh all down in his stomach and his mustache, which was long and sort of straggly. This is a picture of what you find in Google search when you search for the word straggly, because I was looking for something to give a visual example, and this was the first example that I got. This is Jared Leto, and it said something about his straggly hair and straggly beard and mustache. So it's a look. It is not all neat and cut short and trimmed. It's straggly. You can also find another word such as scraggly, all out of place. Of course, Mr. Sweet was an African American man, so you would have to picture an African American version of the hair all straggly. Where was I? And his mustache, which was long and sort of straggly, would shake like Spanish moss, and also that collar. Spanish moss. Let's find examples of that as well. Spanish moss. My handwriting is the cross between a serial killer and a doctor. Not the most flattering description, especially when I write really fast. Spanish moss, and also that collar. Mr. Sweet had been ambitious as a boy, wanted to be a doctor, or a lawyer, or sailor, only to find that black men fare better if they're not. Since he could become none of those things, he turned to fishing as his only earnest career, and playing the guitar as his only claim to doing anything extraordinarily well. His son, the only one that he and his wife Miss Mary had, was shiftless as the day is long, and spent money as if he was trying to see the bottom of the mint, which Mr. Sweet would tell him was the clean brown palm of his hand. Miss Mary loved her baby, however, and worked hard to get him the little necessaries of life, which turned out mostly to be women. In this paragraph, we can find a few examples of how Alice Walker will, in a very subtle manner, put in some elements of what's going around in the times that these characters are living. First of all, when she says here, and by she I mean the narrator of the story, who is this girl who is telling us the story of Mr. Sweet and her relationship with him. So the narrator says, only to find that black men fare better if they're not doctors or lawyers. So this illustrates a period of time in history in the United States, which I myself and a lot of people would agree. We would say that it was part of the ugly history of the United States, racism, segregation, and the consequences of it even after segregation was no longer there. That black people could not get a fair, equal chance, job-wise or in society in general. And Alice Walker was a civil rights activist, was then and still is now. If you would go to her website, alicewalkersgarden.com, you will see that she still does a great deal of work. She's very politically active, even though she's now much older. So she's telling us something here in a very subtle manner. She just put it in there that black men fare better if they don't choose those professions. Why? Why would they say that? Because back in the day, the 60s, this was too recent. They abolished all the segregation, but the ugly part of history was still there. There were still reminiscent feelings and attitudes that still belonged with segregation, so people wouldn't want to have a doctor who was black, a lawyer who was black. Maybe a lot of black people would, but even some black people wouldn't, because of how they were made to think that they weren't good enough. So this is part of the racism in America, which, let us just say, is not at all as bad as it was back in the day. There has been a lot of progress over the years. Something else that I'd like to point out from this paragraph: expressions, idiomatic expressions. Idiomatic expressions are colloquialisms, are ways in which you can express yourself in a way that you would with people, instead of thinking of a formal way of writing or putting down words to impress people. You're just being natural. And a lot of the language, when the girl is narrating the story, the language is real. So an idiomatic expression here: little necessaries, lil instead of little. And it's even written this way so that we can hear how it's supposed to be said. And nowadays in hip-hop and in a lot of raps, we find this. We have Lil Kim, Lil Wayne. Those are names of rappers and hip-hop artists. And it's a trendy thing to use nowadays also, even though this story was written years and years ago, decades ago. So it's a different usage for the same thing. Moving along, Mr. Sweet was a tall, Finnish man with thick, kinky hair, going dead white. Kinky hair is a way of describing African American textured hair. I'm a black Brazilian, which means I'm mixed with a whole bunch of different things, so I can't really use my hair as an example. But if you think of somebody who has that beautiful textured hair that is thicker and so curly that you almost can't see the curls, they're so tiny, that's kinky hair. Going dead white. He was dark brown, His eyes were squinty like this, and sort of bluish. So they weren't completely blue, they were bluish. When you say that something is not quite, for instance, I tell you guys, well, I'll meet you guys around 5-ish, meaning not at 5, but maybe 5:05, 5:10, 5-ish, so not quite blue, but bluish. And he chewed brown mule tobacco. He was constantly on the verge of being blind drunk, for he brewed his own liquor, and was not in the least a stingy sort of man. A stingy person is somebody that doesn't really want to spend a lot of money, just wants to hold it to him or herself. And in Brazilian culture, this is the gesture for stingy. You just say, oh, that person's a little. It means that they hold on to their money so tight they don't want to give it away or share it with anybody. Where was I? Here we go. He was constantly on the verge of being blind drunk, for he brewed his own liquor, and was not in the least a stingy sort of man. So Mr. Sweet was a very giving person, and was always very melancholy and sad, though frequently, when he was feeling good, and here you have feeling spelled without the ing, which gives you a difference in pronunciation, because when you have feeling ing, there is a specific way in which you pronounce it, and it may not be quite obvious for somebody who's not a native speaker, or for somebody that hasn't been observing phonetics and phonology of the English language, but there is a difference between saying feeling good and feeling good. It's a longer sound when the ing is fully pronounced, and here feeling good without the ing sound. And you will see there's a lot in music, living, feeling without the ing, and it's a colloquialism, again, an idiomatic expression, if you will, a way of saying things in a simpler way. Feeling good, he'd dance around the yard with us, usually keeling over, meaning falling down, keeling over, falling down, and just out of exhaustion and out of all the excitement. Just as my mother came to see what the commotion was. Toward all of us children he was very kind, and had the grace to be shy with us, which is unusual in grown-ups. He had great respect from my mother, for he never held his drunkenness against him. She never held his drunkenness against him, and would let us play with him, even when he was about to fall in the fireplace from drink. So he was drunk, but nobody judged him for this. Nobody treated him in a specific different way just because he was drunk. Although Mr. Sweet would sometimes lose complete or nearly complete control of his head and neck, so that he would loll in his chair like that, he would be like out of balance. His mind remained strangely acute, and his speech not too affected. This is interesting because this is what was unique, was special about Mr. Sweet, because he would not be the type of drunk who is unable to function. He could still function. Usually when people are drunk, their speech is slurred. I'm gonna have another drink, something like that. But his speech was not affected by this. His mind remained strangely acute, so his mind was sharp. He could still think and function. And his speech not too affected. His ability to be drunk and sober at the same time made him an ideal playmate, for he was as weak as we were, and we could usually bath him in wrestling, all the while keeping a fairly coherent conversation going. Coherent, meaning a conversation that makes sense, that people can understand, a back and forth interaction where people are present and they can understand each other. We never felt anything of Mr. Sweet's age when we played with him. We loved his wrinkles. You know, wrinkles, like when you get old, you start to get wrinkles in your face. You start to get all, your face, the skin in your face changes and becomes wrinkly. Some people wear it well. Some people get plastic surgery and decide to look like this instead. We loved his wrinkles and would draw some of our eyebrows, to be like him. And his white hair was my special treasure, and he knew it, and could never come to visit us just after he had had his hair cut at the barber shop. Once he came to our house for something, probably to see my father about fertilizer for his crops, because although he never paid the slightest attention to his crops, he liked to know that what things would be best to use on them, if he ever did. Anyhow, he had not come with his hair, since he had just had it shaved off at the barber shop. He wore a huge straw hat to keep off the sun, and also to keep his head away from me. But as soon as I saw him, I ran up and demanded that he take me up and kiss me with his funny beard, which smelled so strongly of tobacco. Looking forward to burying my small fingers into his woolly hair. And you think of wool, what you use for knitting? Wool. A lot of Norwegian women knit. So wool is something everybody is familiar with. And they're just comparing his hair and his beard to wool. Woolly. Having the quality of wool. Woolly. Woolly hair. I threw away his hat only to find he had done something to his hair. That it was no longer there. I let out a squall, which made my mother think that Mr. Sweet had finally dropped me in the well or something, and from that day I've been wary of manning hats. However, not long after, Mr. Sweet showed up with his hair grown out and just as white and kinky and impenetrable. You can't get through it, it's impenetrable, as it ever was. Mr. Sweet used to call me his princess, and I believed it. He made me feel pretty at 5 and 6 and simply outrageously devastating at the blazing age of 8.5. When he came to our house with his guitar, the whole family would stop whatever they were doing to sit around him and listen to him play. He liked to play whatever they were doing. He liked to play Sweet Georgia Brown. That was what he called me sometimes. And also, he liked to play Caldonia and all sorts of sweet, sad, wonderful songs which he sometimes made up. It was from one of these songs that I heard that he had had to marry Miss Mary when he had in fact loved somebody else, now living in Chicago or Detroit, Michigan. He was not sure that Jolie, her baby, was also his baby. Sometimes he would cry, and that was an indication that he was about to die again. And so, we would all get prepared, for we were sure to be called upon. I was 7 the first time I remember actually participating in one of Mr. Sweet's revivals. My parents told me I had participated before. I had been the one chosen to kiss him and tickle him long before I knew the rite of Mr. Sweet's rehabilitation. He had come to our house, was a few years after his wife's death, and was very sad and also typically very drunk. He sat on the floor next to me and my older brother. The rest of the children were grown up and lived elsewhere, and began to play his guitar and cry. I held his woolly head in my hands, in my arms, and wished I could have been old enough to have been the woman he loved so much, and that I had not been lost years and years ago. When he was leaving, my mother said to us that we'd better sleep late that night, for we'd probably have to go over to Mr. Sweet's before daylight. And we did. For soon after we had gone to bed, one of the neighbors knocked on our door and called my father and said that Mr. Sweet was sinking fast. And if he wanted to get in a word before the crossover, he'd better shake a leg. Another idiomatic expression. To shake a leg means to hurry. Let's get a move on. Let's shake a leg. Let's go. You'd better shake a leg. We'd better shake a leg. We'd better hurry. All the neighbors knew to come to our house if something was wrong with Mr. Sweet, but they did not know how we always managed to make him well, or at least stop him from dying, when he was so often near death. As soon as we heard the cry, we got up, my brother and I and my mother and father, and put on our clothes. We hurried out of the house and down the road, for we were always afraid that we might someday be too late, and Mr. Sweet would get tired of dallying. When we got to the house, a very poor shack really, we found the front room full of neighbors and relatives, and someone met us at the door and said it was all very sad that old Mr. Sweet Little, his last name was Little, for Little was his family name, although we mostly ignored it, was about to kick the bucket. Here's another expression, to kick the bucket, to pass away, to die. And there is actually a movie called The Bucket List with Morgan Freeman and Jack Nicholson, where they make a list of things they will do before they kick the bucket. Therefore, it's called the bucket list, to kick the bucket, to die. My parents were advised not to take my brother and me into the death room, seeing we were so young and all, but we were so much more accustomed to the death room than he was that we ignored him and dashed in, just ran really quickly and dashed in without giving his warning a second thought. I was almost in tears, for these deaths upset me fearfully, and the thought of how much depended on me and my brother, who was such a ham most of the time, made me very nervous. The doctor was bending over the bed and turned back to tell us for at least the 10th time in the history of my family that Alice, old Mr. Sweet, Mr. Sweet Little was dying, and that the children had best not see the face of implacable death. But whatever it was, Mr. Sweet was not. My father pushed him rather abruptly out of the way, saying, as he always did, and very loudly, for he was saying it to Mr. Sweet, "To hell with dying men. These children want Mr. Sweet," which was my cue to throw myself upon the bed and kiss Mr. Sweet around the whiskers, and under the eyes, and around the collar of his nightshirt, where he smelled so strongly of all sorts of things, mostly liniment. I have this list somewhere, but since I lost it, I'm making a list again of the words that I want to either translate to Norwegian or have specifically described to give people at the lecture tonight. I was very good at bringing him around, for as soon as I saw that he was struggling to open his eyes, I knew he was going to be all right, and so could finish my revival sure of success. As soon as his eyes were open, he would begin to smile, and that way I knew that I had surely won. Once, though, I got a tremendous scare, for he could not open his eyes, and later I learned that he had had a stroke that one side of his face and was stiff and hard,
to get into motion. When he began to smile, I could tickle him in earnest because I was sure that nothing would get in the way of his laughter, although once he began to cough so hard that he almost threw me off his stomach. She was a little girl, so you can imagine the difference in ages and sizes. She's growing. As the story is being told, she's growing up. And at this point, she's still a little girl. But that was when I was very small. Little more than a baby, and my bushy hair had gotten in his nose. When we were sure he would listen to us, we would ask him why he was in bed and when he was coming to see us again, and could we play his guitar, which more than likely would be leaning against the bed. His eyes would get all misty, and he would sometimes cry out loud, but we never let it embarrass us, for he knew that we loved him, and that we sometimes cried too for no reason. My parents would leave the room to just the three of us. Mr. Sweet, by that time, would be propped up in bed with a number of pillows behind his head, and with me sitting and lying on his shoulder was along his chest. Even when he had trouble breathing, he would not ask to get me down. Looking into my eyes, he would shake his white head and run a scratchy old finger all around my hairline, which was rather low down, nearly to my eyebrows, and made some people say I looked like a baby monkey. There's also a subtle hint here of how racism affected children growing up. And to be called a monkey when you're little, to be compared to an animal in a negative way, that can influence self-image and make children feel ugly, feel like they're not good enough. There is a book called The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, who is also an African-American author, where the little girl Pecola feels she's ugly because she's black and dark-skinned, and she wants to have blue eyes to adjust to what society thinks is beautiful. So there is a subtle hint here of how this little girl feels, and how Mr. Sweet builds up her self-esteem by calling her a princess, by making her feel that she is too beautiful. My brother was very generous in all of this. He let me do all the revivaling. He had done it for years before I was born, and so was glad to be able to pass it on to someone new. What he would do while I talked to Mr. Sweet was pretend to play the guitar. In fact, pretend that he was a young version of Mr. Sweet, and it always made Mr. Sweet glad to think that someone wanted to be like him. Of course, we did not know this then. We played the thing by ear, and whatever he seemed to like, we did. We were desperately afraid that he was just going to take off one day and leave us. It did not occur to me, did not occur to us, that we were doing anything special. We had not learned that death was final when it did come. We thought nothing of triumphing over it so many times, and in fact became a trifle contemptuous of people who let themselves be carried away. It did not occur to us that if our father had been dying, we would not have stopped it, that Mr. Sweet was the only person over whom we had power. When Mr. Sweet was in his 80s, I was studying in the university many miles from home. I saw him whenever I went home, but he was never on the verge of dying, that I could tell, and I began to feel that my anxiety for his health and psychological well-being was unnecessary. By this time, he not only had a mustache, but a long, flowing, snow-white beard, which I loved and combed and braided for hours. He was very peaceful, fragile, gentle, and the only jarring note about him The only jarring note about him was his old steel guitar, which is still played in the old, sad, sweet, down-home blues way. On Mr. Sweet's 90th birthday, I was finishing my doctorate in Massachusetts and had been making arrangements to go home for several weeks' rest. So here again, a subtle hint, perhaps not so subtle, that this little girl has succeeded. This is an African American girl who grew up at a time when, earlier in the short story, we hear that black men, as ambitious as they were, they didn't want to become doctors or lawyers because they didn't think that they would fare well, because society didn't accept this. Years have gone by. Now Mr. Sweet is in his 90s, and this little girl is doing a doctorate at the university. She has succeeded. People had been calling her baby monkey. She took a tremendous hit in her self-esteem, but that didn't stop her from becoming somebody in life. So this is really important, and it's something that Alice Walker, in her novels, in her poems, in her civil rights movement activism, in everything that she does, she makes sure to put women in a position where they're equals, or at least where they see the potential to be equals to everybody else. And when it comes to women of color in society, in a society that doesn't really accept women of color in the same way as white women, she makes it a point to make it known that this is possible for them as well, and had been making arrangements to go home for a several weeks' rest. That morning, I got a telegram telling me that Mr. Sweet was dying again, and could I please drop everything and come home? Of course I could. My dissertation could wait, and my teachers would understand when I explained to them when I got back. I ran to the phone, called the airport, and within 4 hours I was speeding along the dusty road to Mr. Sweet's. The house was more dilapidated. Dilapidated is a word that means run down, destroyed, worn out. Then when I was last there, barely a shack, but it was overgrown with yellow roses. And here's where, in literature, we have hints of symbolic value. This may or may not be the case, but yellow roses are symbolic of friendship. And Mr. Sweet's friendship with his family, Mr. Sweet's attachment to this family, this friendship, years and years and years of friendship, could be symbolized by these yellow roses growing all around. We have to ask Alice Walker this, because we don't really know if this is what she was thinking. And she's a living author that can still be reached, and maybe one day we'll get to ask her, do the yellow roses in To Hell with Dying have anything to do with the symbolic value for friendship? That's what I would like to ask her. The air was heavy and sweet and very peaceful. I felt strange walking through the gate and up the old rickety steps. Here's a picture of rickety steps. There are certain things that you really can't explain well enough, even if you give somebody the definition or a translation. It is still easier to think and associate an image with a word. So in English teaching, a lot of times I will use pictures to explain things. I'll show a picture of something. I'll show a video, an audio visual image that will stick to your brain and help you learn. The rickety steps. Here she was to see Mr. Sweet again. But the strangeness left me as I caught sight of the long white beard I loved so well, flowing down the thin body in the familiar quilt coverlet. Mr. Sweet. His eyes were closed tight, and his hands crossed over his stomach were thin and delicate, no longer scratchy. I remembered how always before I had run and jumped up on him, just anywhere. Now I knew he would not be able to support my weight. I looked around at my parents and was surprised to see that my father and mother also looked old and frail. My father, his own hair very gray, leaned over the quietly sleeping old man, who incidentally smelled still of wine and tobacco, and said, as he had done so many times, "To hell with Di, man. My daughter is home to see Mr. Sweet." My brother had not been able to come as he was in a war in Asia. I bent down and gently stroked the closed eyes, and gradually they began to open, then closed. Wine-stained lips twitched a little, then parted in a warm, slightly embarrassed smile. Mr. Sweet could see me, and he recognized me, and his eyes to his, and we just looked at each other for a long time. Then he began to trace my peculiar hairline with a thin, smooth finger. I closed my eyes when his finger halted above my ear. He used to rejoice at the dirt in my ears when I was little. His hand stayed cupped around my cheek. When I opened my eyes, sure that I had reached him in time, his eyes were closed. Even at 24, how could I believe that I had failed, that Mr. Sweet was really gone? He had never gone before. But when I looked at my parents, I saw that they were holding back tears. They had loved him dearly. He was like a piece of rare and delicate china, which was always being saved from breaking. Here's a metaphor, a comparison in literature where one thing is compared to another, for you to have an understanding of the situation with him, how frail, how fragile and delicate he was, like china, like porcelain that breaks easily, and everybody saved it from falling, but this time they couldn't do it. They had loved him dearly. He was like a piece of rare and delicate china which was always being saved from breaking and which finally fell. I looked at the old face, the wrinkled forehead, the red lips, the hands that still reached out to me. Soon I felt my father pushing something cool into my hands. It was Mr. Sweet's guitar. He had asked them months before to give it to me. He had known that even if I came next time, he would not be able to respond in the old way. He did not want me to feel that my trip had been for nothing. The old guitar. I plucked the strings, hummed Sweet Georgia Brown. The magic of Mr. Sweet lingered still in a cool steel box. Through the window, I could catch the fragrant, delicate scent of tender yellow roses. Tender yellow roses, which could be symbolism for friendship. The man on the high, old-fashioned bed, with a quilt coverlet and a flowing white beard, had been my first love. This is the end of the short story. Now we have some questions to go over. One of the questions which is not in your worksheet that I would like to ask now: does anybody feel that this little girl's name could be Georgia? And why do you feel this? And where is there evidence in a text that her name could have been Georgia?